Welcome to a great program tonight. Thanks for coming out. This is terrific, a nice crowd of interested folks from Erie on a sunny evening. I really appreciate that. My name is Angela Beaumont, and I'm the Director of Programming at the Jefferson. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we get started. For the Q&A part of the lecture, we will go around with a microphone tonight. You know that the Jefferson wants to shine light, but not bring heat. That means even when we disagree, we are not disagreeable. Please refrain from statements unless they're useful to advance the conversation, which I'm sure we'll have a great one. Water, coffee, and tea, and some snacks are over on this side. There's some programs left in the summer term. We will actually be at Celebrate Erie. You've been maybe looking at the programs here. So on Friday, we'll begin Celebrate Erie with a walking tour of the flagship City Food Hall and Public Market with John Persinger. The tour starts at 4 p.m. and will leave from City Hall. If you can, register, but walk-ins are welcome. On Saturday, we continue at 2 o'clock with Ed Whitbread. He will discuss Lower Parade Street, Erie's Ellis Island. At 3, Katie Kretz will discuss the work of the MCRC of Erie, and at 4, Jenny Tompkins will talk about protection of our watersheds. On Sunday afternoon, the Jefferson concludes its summer programs at Celebrate Erie with a look into our political history with Pat Cuneo and Erie's history as the fishing capital of the world with David Frew. But let's turn our attention to tonight's lecture with Dr. Jackson Janes, who will discuss the next steps NATO and Germany take to assist Ukraine in its ongoing war with Russia. Dr. Janes, you were a Global Summit speaker in 2017 and did a talk in 2019. We appreciate your expertise in transatlantic affairs, and it is my great pleasure to have you back in Erie. Thank you for making the journey from Washington, D.C. Dr. Jackson Janes is the President Emeritus of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at the Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. They're located on Massachusetts Avenue. Dr. Janes has been engaged in German-American affairs in numerous capacities over many years. He was the director of the German-American Institute in Tübingen and directed the European Office of the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Bonn. He was also chair of the German-speaking areas in Europe program at the Foreign Service Institute in Washington, D.C., and president of the International Association for the Study of German Politics. Dr. Janes has lectured throughout Europe and the United States and has published extensively on issues dealing with Germany, German-American relations, and transatlantic affairs. He has appeared on all major public and cable news network, radio, and on German television. Dr. Janes is listed in Who's Who in America and Who's Who in Education. In 2005, he was awarded the Officer's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany, Germany's highest civilian award. I'd like to thank our speaker, our scholars in residence, our board, our staff, our members, and of course, our audience today. If you're interested in becoming a Jefferson member or a volunteer, please talk to our staff or take a brochure. Take our latest, newest brochure, membership brochure, that already shows the lineup for the Global Summit. Without the support of our members and the Erie community, we would not be here today, so thank you for coming. A warm Jefferson welcome for our speaker, Dr. Jackson Janes.
Thank you. Is that the first one?
All the way back. There we go.
Okay, great.
And here's the clicker.
Oh, yeah.
It is on.
The button, this one here, right?
That's the pointer, and back and forth is on the side. So forward you go this.
Okay, great. Technical stuff. Thank you very much, Angela. It's been great to have a chance to come back to Erie. I was thinking about this on the way down because, or way up, I suppose I could say. I'm often thinking about the fact that so many great cities and so many great places around the world are located on a river or near water. And I like to think that that's somehow a bit of a cleansing opportunity because when you live near a city, when you live in the case of Erie, or if you're in Washington, D.C., and you're on the Potomac, there is an openness there, I find, that I associate with water passing through a community and opening your horizons. I happen to be a very avaricious rower on the Potomac, and in doing so, I'm on a river, and those of you who know that sport know that when you row, you don't always know where you're going. And one of my favorite theologians, Kierkegaard, once said, life is experienced forwards, but it's understood backwards, and normally that's what happens when you're on the water. But in any case, I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to speak about something that is so, at the moment, so gripping for all of us. I had just spent 2 months in Germany in this period of time trying to figure out what it was that this particular event impacted on Germany per se. It certainly is impacted here, and it's impacted, quite frankly, all around the world. An unprovoked attack on a sovereign country, and it has rattled so many different dimensions of the relationships within Europe, across the Atlantic, and on the global stage. I'm not sure exactly how it's going to play out. I don't think anybody knows right now. But I thought what I would try to do at this point is just two things. Give you a little bit of a picture of where I think things are at the moment in terms of dealing with the Ukraine crisis. And then I want to back up a little bit, if you'd like, and tell you a little bit about the mood, or shall we say the sense of what Germany's perception is of its role and its responsibilities in dealing with this biggest crisis since 1945. So let me start out by just remembering here where Ukraine is. And just by looking at that map, and I'm sure everybody knows the answer to this question, but I'll pose it to you anyway. With what state is Ukraine comparative with in the United States?
Texas.
Exactly. Almost the same size. And yet you can see, a number of other countries around Ukraine that are a lot smaller. And so you give the dynamic, the enormous magnitude of a 44 million population in a country of that size, and then you can understand what the impact is of this war that is happening on the doorstep of all of Europe. I had just a sense of looking back and thinking about things that have happened, certainly since February. As you probably already know, Ukraine has been offered a candidacy for a member in the EU, although, let's say it this way, it's not going to happen tomorrow. But it's at least an offer of recognition of a state that is aspiring to be independent and to be able to survive this war intact. You can see that there are other potential candidates as well. Turkey is one of them, and it's been a candidate since 1964. Whether that happens ever is a question in and of itself, but let's not dwell on Turkey. And then there are some other states that are interested. And of course, there is one former member of the EU who we remember not so fondly in my case, but nevertheless. And I think it's an interesting aspect of the fact that, and I'll show a picture of the dramatic moments of 2014 during the initial parts of the war that then was declared or actually activated in 2022 in the middle of Kiev. But in any event, it's important to remember that the European response to this war is to have gone ahead and said, we accept you now as a potential candidate in the EU. Again, it's not going to happen for quite a long time, but at least it's a recognition. Let me go back a little bit in history here. This is the way Europe looked in 1989. You don't see Ukraine. It's part in this particular map. It is essentially because Ukraine was one of the republics that formed the Soviet Union at the end of World War I. And it's always been treated as its own republic within the USSR, in contrast to what Mr. Putin thinks about Ukraine not really having an application for existence as its own state, but it's always been there since the start of the Soviet Union. So this was the way that many of the countries looked before the wall fell in Berlin. And then there was this. And I bring this to your attention as well because you can see in the space of the last 30 years, including 2 countries that have now added themselves to the application for membership in NATO, Sweden and Finland, how all of those countries that you just saw in red are now members of NATO. I mention that largely because of the fact that one of the arguments that you hear from Putin is that we caused this war because of the fact that we rolled over them and forced people to become a member of NATO, which of course is not very persuasive when you look at the facts. But all of those people, all of those countries, if you go up as far as Estonia and work your way down all the way to Romania, you can see that a lot of those countries managed to, in the last 30 years, put themselves under the umbrella of NATO for a reason. And that is something that I think that Ukraine would like to have, does not have at the moment, but at least it's a step further in terms of being perhaps a member of the EU down the line. By the way, these are neutral countries, Ireland, and of course, Switzerland and Austria. In any event, that gives you a sense, I think, of where Ukraine fits into the larger picture of Europe and why it's so important, and why, in many ways, the argument, at least that I make and many others do with me, is that it must remain an independent country. If we can talk about how that's going to perhaps unfold later on, but I just want to emphasize the fact that that's the assumption that anybody who is supporting Ukraine right now is making. Now, what you see here, of course, is the parts of Ukraine that Russia has effectively not only occupied, by the way, since 2014 in many ways, but also trying to figure out how they can expand that. And they started with Crimea. And you know that that happened in 2014, a very dubious process by which he simply proclaimed that an agreement that Khrushchev had made with Ukraine back in 1994 was no longer valid, and that the Crimeans want to be part of Russia anyway, but that has not been recognized by the EU. And the red is, of course, the efforts on the part of the Russians now to depict those parts of Ukraine that were heavily occupied by Russians, ethnic Russians, and to essentially do to them what they did with Crimea, to, in other words, absorb them, to become part and parcel of Russia, perhaps, down the line. But exactly at this point, how far Mr. Putin is going to go, remember now we're into multiple weeks, if not months, of this war, which he felt would probably have been resolved in the first week. And so it's not going to be clear as to how long this particular standoff is going to occur. My sense from the people that I talked to in Washington is that this is going to be a very, very long walk. And in many ways, the Ukrainians, which of course have this area up here, that is a huge, big area. And remember, there are 44 million people that lived in Ukraine, so many have left now as refugees. But the question is, how are the Ukrainians going to be able to hold the Russians where they are now? And the answer to that is they can't unless they have support from the West, particularly from, at this point, the United States and the rest of Europe. So this is a vicious war. that's going on right now. And it's going to be very, very important that you perhaps pay attention to the news on August 24th, because that's the anniversary of the independence of Ukraine. It's entirely possible that Mr. Putin will use that as an example to show how much he can actually still hurt Ukraine well beyond those red areas. That's the status of at the moment. Sevastopol here was one of the reasons why Putin wanted to grab Crimea, because there was a warm water port that was just there for them to take. I think that the realistic question is, can that ever be returned to Ukraine, or is it lost? And I think that's an open question at this point. I should mention simply in passing, because I'm sure you're aware of it, that the Russians have lost a lot of men. I don't know how reliable the figures are, but the ones that I've seen in Washington are upwards of 60 to 70,000. The Ukrainians are losing 100 a day. And so the question is going to be, how long is this stalemate going to continue, at what cost, for which side? And it's a horrific cost, particularly if you look at the scenes of those cities, particularly Mariupol, if you've ever looked at that. It's a war crime. But in any case, that's where I just wanted to point at where things are now. One of the things that I wanted to make sure you notice, again, up there on the Belarus side, Belarus is not exactly an independent country. And the question is whether it will throw its weight behind any further attack on Ukraine from the north. That hasn't happened yet. Okay, so that's where the current battle lines are. I put this picture up to remind you of 2000, the Maidan, the battle over the independence of Ukraine, and how the evolution of a sense of patriotism and to some extent a sense of independence became so vivid in that particular moment in time in 2014. That is really when the war began. It wasn't only in February of this year. The Ukrainians, if you talk to them, they say they've been fighting this war for 8 years. Because as soon as this happened, and as soon as Putin realized that he had no more control over Ukraine, he then began to kind of slip into these areas that I just showed you before, and began to support those, what he now calls republics. So this has been going on since then. And you have to realize that that's how long this battle has been fought, and is being fought. This is a picture of the spirit with which Mr. Putin overtook Crimea. This is in Sevastopol, but it's essentially a picture of the way the Russians decided that they were simply going to absorb Crimea. So in the map of Russia today that you'll find in Moscow, you would see Crimea as part of Russia. In the maps that we have on our side, we don't have that as a given. And let me remind you one thing. I had an opportunity a long time ago to talk to a high-level Russian from Moscow who was making a point about the fact that the vulnerability of Ukraine and Crimea could be echoed in the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And I reminded this guy that when the Russians and the Nazis made a deal in 1939, and on that day of September 1, the Russian troops began to attack the Baltics as well as the eastern side of Poland. That particular absorption of those three Baltic states was never, ever recognized by the United States. So in 1991, they regained their independence. So I told this guy, we can wait. And the question is how long it's going to take if you think about that, because that was 40 years. But in any case, that was just this martialized sense of overtaking Crimea and adding it to his scrapbook. I mentioned that Ukraine had 44 million people in its population before February 24th. Millions have fled, and a large number of them have fled here. Now you can see where obviously a good many of the people fled to Poland because of the next door neighbor and because of the sympathy with which the Poles received those refugees, which was quite remarkable. And we're talking, this figure here is at that point 4 million people that are pouring over the borders on an everyday basis. The other pockets of heavy concentrations are Germany, of course, and the Czech Republic. But even, countries like Moldova, who are also in a somewhat tenuous position with regard to Putin's appetite, are taking in many of those people. So these are a distribution at this point of those people who have fled out from Ukraine to the West. What is not known is how many of the Ukrainians that were virtually held hostage during the attacks, for example, in Mariupol, were taken to Russia. That we do not know. Those figures are unknown. But what's concerning a lot of people now at the moment is that movement of those people that were forced into going toward Russia and not toward the West. What's going to happen to them? What do we know about them? And what do we know about the younger people in particular? So there are people that have gone from Ukraine to, across the border into Russia, perhaps not at their own will. But nevertheless, you can see how Europe has opened its doors. And if I could just open a parenthesis here, in 2015, there was a mass migration of other people who wanted to knock on the doors of Europe, and you all remember that. And that being a moment in time when Mrs. Merkel made a name for herself by saying that she was going to open the doors to those immigrants that were pouring into Germany, 1 million strong at that time. Well, now you've got a lot more. And this is not by any way over the way the war is occurring here. So you have, for example, up here where it says here, majorities have gone to the immediate vicinity. The individuals across Europe, numbers upwards of 5 million. It's hard to know how many are registered or where they're registered, but the fact of the matter is that there's a lot there that are basically in the position of either staying where they are or perhaps going back at some point or another, which some of them are doing. So it's a question at this point of a standoff at a point at which we just can't make any projections about what's going to happen to all of these people. I mentioned something here which was in the news recently. You might have seen it. There was an attempt on the part of getting the Ukraine's wheat, which is a huge, big breadbasket. It always has been, going back decades, if not centuries. Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. Well, it's now the breadbasket of the world, and you can see how a lot of it has been impacting around not just Europe, but also in Africa and the Middle East. This war has caused the danger of a famine. If that wheat that had been stored in those big, huge places in Odessa or near the ports was simply let to rot. And eventually they got a deal made that, interestingly enough, was made by the leader of Turkey to get some ships out of there and get this wheat into the hands of other countries that are in desperate need of it in Africa. But it's an important notion of something that I really wanted to emphasize again, that this is not just a European war. This is something that's got global ripples in so many different places. And I think a lot of people, perhaps in the United States, people that I know, probably were having a difficulty trying to find Ukraine on a map when all of this stuff began to kind of really roll into a real boiling pot. But you can see how this particular dimension of Ukraine's capacity to create food for the world is just as important as those that are in top there, France, Canada, the United States, and Russia. It's important to remember that. This again depicts that. You can see, interestingly enough, how important sunflower oil is, which I never knew. But that is an enormous amount. When you think about this, if I can go back for a minute just to show you again, the size of that country, you're right, it's the size of Texas, but it's also very agricultural. And so a lot of that farmland and a lot of that area that had been the source for those products that we just looked at, these, are now in danger of being racked up against in this war, not to speak of a certain nuclear plant that is now under duress because it's being fired at it's being fired at from various different directions. Now, just to make a final point on the global side of this issue, one of the major questions that's been raised in Washington is about whether or not any kind of effort on the part of Europe, in particular, United States as well, to effectively try to reach an accord with Putin is closely being watched in China. And I'm sure you're all aware of what happened when Pelosi took her group and went to Taiwan the other day and how the Chinese responded to that. But I know from a lot of people that are China experts that the Chinese are watching very carefully how this is being handled and to what extent the Europeans and the US together are going to try to work out whatever arrangement can be achieved in the name of stopping the slaughter in these particular moments, but also not giving in to effectively a person who's kicked over the apple cart with regard to the way that we have lived over the last 5-6 decades respecting borders. And that particular island here, this one, is very much on the minds of a lot of people who are worried about the implications of a bad deal in Ukraine for Taiwan. And a lot of people who are worried about that live in Taiwan. So again, it's a global sense of change here that I think we don't want to underestimate. A lot of people that I've spoken to in different parts of the world have been saying, this is like in Brazil or in India, they'll say, well, basically that's your problem. You have a problem with the Russians. You sort it out. And I point out the fact that that is not the case. This is a great deal more at stake. It's more about the way that we understand the future of Europe. Because if this particular moment in time is essentially going to result in Putin having essentially won his side of this argument, Ukraine not really a country, Ukraine not really independent, part of Russia. If that happens, what's the next agenda item after that? And I think everybody's worried about that in Europe, but there's a lot more to this when you broaden the scope of the issues that are on the agenda elsewhere around the globe. We're talking about a world community, a world in which we have been living in the last several decades, in which effectively people have said, we're going to respect borders. Well, if that's no longer the case, who makes the decisions about who should be respected and who shouldn't, and what should be respected? So that's why I throw this up there, just to make sure you can see how far this ripple effect of Ukraine is. Now, I said before, I want to briefly go back and talk a little bit about Germany in particular here, because it's so absolutely central to solving the problem. I think all of you are aware of the fact that there's a gas crisis at the moment, in particularly with regard to the Germans, who have been relying on Russian gas and oil for quite a long time. What you see here is a picture of various pipelines. Maybe the one that you've heard most about is Nord Stream, which is this one up here. There's actually two of them, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Those two sources were basically providing half of what Germany needs when it comes to gas for people's homes and factories, and a third of the oil that they also need for the same source of energy. But there are a lot of other pipelines here that come in from various different directions, and they're not even down here further south into Qatar and places that are not on this map. And what you see, interestingly enough, is that the main route for Russian gas is the ones with, you can see these here. These are the ones that have been built up over the last, well, 40, 50 years. We can get into a question about why the Germans did that, but the fact of the matter is that's a huge, big source but it used to, of gas and oil coming in from Russia, but it used to come in also from Ukraine via Russia, Ukraine, into Germany as well. Now, Russia's got this hand on its faucet and can turn it off and turn it on and turn it off as it pleases. So what they're trying to do now, all through Europe, is to figure out what additional sources of pipelines can be brought into play to feed the energy needs of countries throughout Europe, and that includes LNG. Now, LNG is something that in some ways is new to Germans because they don't have, at the moment, LNG ports, but they do have them down in here. You can see how much coastline there is here, Spain and Portugal. So the point is that there is a very large web of pipelines that feed Europe from different directions, and it's growing, which leads me to think that there are different ways of ratcheting back the need for the Nord Stream source. That's going to take time, though. It's going to take 5 years or more. And so that's a little bit of a race between the political capacity of the country to make those transitions while keeping people's heaters on during the winter. But again, it's a very large map, and the solving of this energy problem is going to have to be done not just by country, but it's going to have to be done all over Europe. Now, on Germany's case, you can see here what their mix is. They've got a lot of brown coal. They had that in their own ground, and hard coal. But they have a mix of things that they are using to diversify where they need the overall amount of 488 billion kilowatts. And they're going to have to speed up what it is that they were trying to do with alternative renewables. They're going to have to speed up getting LNG ports. They're going to have to speed up figuring out what else they can do with solar. And those of you who have traveled in Germany recently, maybe up in the north particularly, you see forests of windmills up and down the coast. And they're being built in a lot of different places. It's only 27%, but it's a lot when you think about the overall context of it. So the Germans are thinking about making this mix capable of being able to ratchet back what it is that they need from what they've been taking heretofore from Russia and in the form of gas and oil. Notice one thing here, nuclear power. I think you'll all remember what happened in Fukushima in 2005, and that scared the hell out of Germans. And Merkel picked that up immediately and said, okay, well then we're going to cut out nuclear power altogether. This year, the last 3 nuclear plants were supposed to be shut down this year. Yesterday, they decided not to do that. Now, you would think that that would be a no-brainer because of the fact that they need to have continuing diversification of their energy supply. But here's the thing. There's a Green Party in the federal coalition in Berlin. Can you imagine what kind of calisthenics they had to go through to get that through their own public domain? But they're doing it. And the Minister of Economics is the Vice Chancellor of Germany, and he's a Green. So there is an effort on the part of the Germans to figure out how they're going to be able to emancipate themselves from what has been a long-term dependency, ever growing, on Russian oil and gas. But it's a time factor. And that's why they're going to have to figure out what they can do to increase this side of the equation, and not necessarily add a whole hell of a lot more coal, because of course that's also against their environmental standards. But again, this is the emergency they're in. I think this particular year, between now and July, or shall we say now and March, will be a real test for this coalition. It depends on how cold it gets in Germany, and how many people are going to start complaining about the fact that they don't have enough power to, or their apartment isn't warm enough. Apart from the business community, which is beginning to be very nervous about having to cut back on their supply. But anyway, this is what Germans are faced with at the moment. This is quickly to tell you, how gas goes up in different times of the year. The price goes up with it, depending on the temperature. We'll have to wait and see what happens. I mean, it was hotter. It was very hot this summer. What the winter will turn out to be, I don't know. But it isn't just Germany that's in play here. This is the 7-day average value of daily Russian gas exports to the EU. It's gone down, you can see, since February 24th. Well, not just Germany, but all of Europe is trying to reduce its dependency on Russian gas, but it's going to take a while because they just can't, they can't snap it this way. They're going to have to depend on how they can stretch this out over what period of time. Meanwhile, the money that's going into the coffers in Moscow as they make all of this gas and continue to sell it to the Europeans and to countries that really don't have quite as many qualms as Germans do, like in Hungary, are making a fortune. So it's feeding the engines that are, of course, capable of feeding the war in Ukraine. And this is, again, the pipelines that showing you how they're trying to cut down on the impact of the Nord Stream connections here. Again, these are the prices that you can see of gas going up. This is going to be a very big test for the coalition to see how far they can provide the citizens of Germany, in particular, with some subsidies so that they won't get caught in a real trap here in the winter. And just for fun, I know this is in German, but this is what they're saying the Germans have to do. 39% should reduce their source of energy by taking shorter showers and turning off, their computers if they're not using them, or maybe buying a new heater, or even turning their thermostat down, or cooking less. I don't know how that's going to work in Germany, but in any event, these are just the ideas that are being floated around to see what the population at large can do to figure out how they can deal with this very important crisis. That's what I was going to show you, just basically on the immediacy of Ukraine. And in the end, what I'm talking about here is that the Germans, like others, are going to have to balance out what it is that they're going to be able to do for Ukraine to keep it sustained in its effort to hold off the Russian threat and the Russian attack, while they're still trying to figure out what it is that they need for their own economy and their own sources of energy. It's not going to be an easy balance. Now, I will maybe stop here and ask if you want to go into any detail about what I've just proposed, but I will say two things in addition. Chancellor Scholz gave a speech on the 24th of February, and it was billed as something called eine Zeitenwende, a change of the thinking in Germany about a lot of things, not necessarily only about whether or not they are going to need nuclear power, but their role on the stage dealing with a crisis that Ukraine is so reflective of. And this has caused a catharsis in Germany about its role as it sees itself in Europe, as it has seen itself over the last 3 or 4 or 5 decades, since really the wall came down, which was essentially saying, we are a peaceful power. We are a power that learned from our history, And therefore, our thoughts were that we would be able to be as helpful as we could in forging peace in Europe, particularly with Russia, if we were able to find a way to work with the Russians. And part of that was to buy their gas and their oil. It was called Wandel durch Annäherung. It was called change through connections that people would have with the business community in Russia. And the thought was that after Russia became Russia, in other words, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia would be able to be brought into the European fold and become part of maybe even part of the European Union. In that process, that particular notion of Germany's sense of what its responsibilities were was not placed on the military side. It was placed on the economic side. The speech that the Chancellor gave on the 24th of February was to say, no, we now have to rearm. We now have to create a new army, and we have to support Ukraine. Think about that for a minute. Europeans were waiting for that to happen so that perhaps Germany would be a little bit more active in Ukraine. But the very fact that Germany is saying we're going to rearm and the Europeans are saying they're relieved is a big change from the past. So I think that to some extent, what the Europeans are now fussing with is Germany's not doing enough. And the Germans feel a little bit like between, a rock and a hard place. They don't want to get out too much in front of things. They were thinking that they would, help Ukraine as much as they could, but then they found out that they didn't have much to help with. And it's a very, very strange development in the German psyche at the moment, which under this rubric of Zeitenwende, Germans are coping with now. What is our responsibility on the world stage? What do we have to do to help a country like Ukraine that's in trouble? But what other responsibilities do we carry? It's a big change, and again, something that doesn't come easy because of the weight of the German past on all things when it comes to thinking about the role of Germany as a country that is still under the shadow of World War II. And then the second thing, I think, is the sense that they feel, or at least Mr. Scholz, I think, feels that it's important that we keep a dialogue going with Russia because of the geography. Russia's not going to go away. It's always going to be there. But the problem with that is that all of those European countries up and down the eastern flank are very upset about Germany's willingness to tolerate perhaps something at the end, which may be talking to Putin about some form of a peace, or what the Israelis say in their particular situation, land for peace, without necessarily consulting with them. So this is a combustion of politics, of history, of psychological change going on within the German society at large. I would even say it's a generational issue, because I think that the older Germans are more attuned to the fact that, hey, we put aside what our past told us to put aside, which is not to become a military power again, and to focus on being a power for peace. And the younger people, and that includes, I think, quite frankly, oddly enough, for many of us who followed the Greens for many, many years, a very strong, vociferous response to the attack on Ukraine among the younger generations. So there's something going on in Germany that's going to happen this coming year. It's going to be very interesting to watch, but Germany is going to be forcing itself into a posture of being a nation that is more inclined in the past not to want to get out too much in front, but now it's being asked to, because it has the ability, it has the economic power to do so, and it certainly has or should have the will. A lot of things are happening elsewhere in Europe. In London, we don't know who's going to become the next chancellor, the next prime minister there. Mr. Macron is a little weaker in Paris than he was before. So a lot of the focus, I know for a fact in Washington, a lot of the focus is on Berlin. And Berlin feels it. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how the Ukrainian war unfolds further, what Germany's role will be, and how there will be a balance in the German society about how much we can do to make sure that we've got the Europe that we've created, that we've helped build over the last 50 years. How do we keep it? And at the same time, how do we keep our thermostats on? And that's the kind of thing that I think is going to be a challenge for any coalition, but particularly for this one, which is a very, very unique one. It's never happened before. You've got an SPD. You had an SPD Green coalition in 1998, but now you've got a SPD Greens FDP coalition. It's very unusual. It's experimental, and we shall see what they do with it. And everybody's watching. Let me stop there. And thank you for your patience. I just wanted to paint a picture. Yes, sir.
So there were some earlier reports, maybe months ago. There were some earlier reports, maybe months ago, that Germany thought they could drastically reduce or maybe even completely get off of Russian gas by the end of this year. And it's now you're saying it's, and that seemed a little far-fetched to me, but you're thinking it's a 5-year plan.
Yeah.
It almost seems to me it's going to come down to, as you illustrated, does Putin need the money more than he needs to, than Germans need the gas? Because if I were Putin, I'd be shutting off the gas, right? And try to force some sort of dialogue. But what do you think about that?
Well, I do think that you know, the issue is that you're going to have an internal battle in Germany with regard to some parties, one of which will be the left party, which is mimicking Putin's arguments, unfortunately. But also people on the right that are saying, you know, this is, we don't have to be fighting the Russians. We have our own problems here, and the Ukrainians are kind of corrupt anyway. I mean, you have a lot of that talk as well, particularly in Eastern Germany, by the way, I should say. So the balance is going to be, you know, if they're expecting that Putin will turn off the faucet on both Nord Stream 1 and 2, how much of their, shall we say, their boiler tanks are going to be full? Right now, they're about 75%. How can they get through this winter and at the same time be boiling up the rest of these resources to make do with what they're going to be missing, which has been substantial? And the business community is really nervous. I'm thinking about companies like Daimler, Bosch, BASF. They take a huge amount of power to power up their turbines to make the stuff they make. And so, as one of them said to me, yeah, we can you know, back off on not necessarily getting that stuff from Putin through those 2 pipelines, but then what's happened to our economy? And what about all those people that may lose their jobs in the process? So it's going to be a really dicey situation. And I don't think they're going to be able to turn that stuff. They've reduced the amount of gas already, but I don't think they can basically wave a magic wand and say it's not completely, it's not necessary anymore. It's going to be a really problem. I agree with you.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Just to put some perspective, I went to Warsaw and worked at the World Central Kitchen back in March and April.
Wow.
And to put some perspective on how the Europeans think, the young people, I met a lot of young Polish people, volunteers there
Right.
in Warsaw.
Right.
And they honestly believe that Poland is in Putin's sights.
Yeah.
Okay, that's where the Europeans are at. And I think I recently heard on NPR, they're talking about running a pipeline from Portugal and also, I guess, coming to some agreement with Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if those pipelines were going to Germany or where they were going. I had no idea that there was any type of a port there in Portugal, where I guess that's what propane is what
LNG. It's called
LNG,
liquefied natural gas.
Liquefied gas.
Yeah.
And since you're the smart guy, okay, I'm probably going to open up a can of worms by asking this question, because I know when I spoke to the young people there in Poland, it didn't matter, young, old, it didn't matter, that they were happy that Joe Biden was sitting in the White House. And I guess my question is, if the last guy would have been sitting in the White House right now and all this is taking place, where do you think we would be? I mean, a lot of people think it would be World War III. That Putin, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say what the answer to that is.
Yeah. Speculating on what the past is what Mr. Trump loves to do. I think that basically the Poles, remember, were not necessarily put off by him as others were, because he went to Warsaw and spoke there. Poland has got a very tense relationship with Brussels, and you know, Trump's administration didn't really have a great deal of love left over for the EU anyway. But I think that what you're saying though is that the Poles are pushed between wanting to have an ability to protect themselves, because you're right, they, like the Baltics, feel the breath, the hot air of Russians that are right on their border and occupied them for 4.5 decades. And I think that, you know, and the Poles, of course, can go back even further to the 18th century when they didn't even exist because of Catherine the Great. But I think under the circumstances, what you're talking about here is the fact that the Poles have an enormous commitment, as you can see from the refugees, as do others in Eastern Europe, to make sure that there is an answer to the conundrum. Putin can't win and Ukraine can't lose. Wow. How do we figure that out in the next several months and years? And this could take years. As long as the Ukrainians are willing to fight and we provide them with the weapons to do that, they're the ones that are fighting on our behalf. So the question becomes then, how much can they take? And what is Mr. Putin's incentive, other than to say, okay, well, I'll tell you what, I've got these little parts down here, I'll stick with them for now. Who's to say what will happen down the road a bit? So I think that everybody's concerned about that, and that's why the Poles are very, very vehement. I mean, the president of Poland went to and spoke in the parliament in Kyiv. So, you know, that just shows you that despite all of the fact that they're so angry with the EU over another set of issues totally different from Ukraine, there's still this need to realize, as the Poles have been saying to the Germans for 40 years, what are you doing making yourself so dependent on the Russians with gas and oil for? What are you thinking? Well, the Germans' response to that was pretty clear. We don't believe the Russians are going to do anything bad. They've been sort of supporting us with their gas and oil for, you know, since the 60s. What would be the incentive for them to not do that anymore? Well, nobody counted on the fact that somebody thinks he's Peter the Great, reborn. So that's why this is a very complicated tapestry in there.
Plus China's watching.
Yeah, well, that's why I put that map up there. I lost count here. Maybe you.
Yes, Doctor, a couple ideas. First of all, from a military standpoint, the Ukrainians want NATO warplanes. How badly would that put Putin's back to the wall? And the other idea I was thinking of is the enthusiasm within, say, ex-military and contractors who are helping the Ukrainians. Is it waning, or is it still, because, I mean, there's one country and it's Russia and its allies versus, you know, who else is going to help the Ukrainians? Your thoughts, sir?
Well, I think that the Europeans in general, if you look at a list, I mean, it's very much on the public domain. The Ukrainians have received help from everybody from Finland to Romania. In other words, yes, the U.S. carries the bulk because we make the stuff. And, you know, it's quicker for us to make it than maybe for many of the other people in Europe, because they were making it in smaller dimensions, particularly the Germans, which really kind of let their army languish for the last 20, 30 years. So we could produce stuff and we could get it into the hands of the Ukrainians much quicker than the Europeans could. But having said that, the Dutch, the Baltics, the Czechs, certainly the Poles, were quite willing to provide what they had in their own army, thinking that that would then be perhaps reupholstered with the help of the United States and maybe Germany as well. So the point is that there is a lot of help coming toward Ukraine from various different directions. But quite frankly, Germany is a huge, big exporter of military weapons. They sell it to a lot of countries. And so the question is, where is that can then be put into the hands of Ukrainians? And that's an interesting question, which I don't really have a clear answer for. But in the end, I think that as long as the U.S. sticks by its commitment, regardless of what happens in 2024, I think Ukraine has a chance to hold off, because those people are so committed. They're losing 100 people a day, right? And yet they don't want to give in. So I think that basically it's going to be, as I said before, it's going to be a long walk. And as long as we are here, and this is what I hear from the German and a lot of people in other parts of Europe, if you guys stick with your commitment, then we will as well. But if there's a weak link here, then we got a problem. I'm right here, sir. I'm sorry, I lost it. Okay, go ahead.
On the flip side here,
Yeah.
how long can Putin feel secure in staying in power if he's lost 60 to 70,000 men and lost all the weaponry that he's lost and continues to lose? How long does people in Russia start looking at him that are in power and decide maybe it's time to remove him?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I mean, I've talked to a lot of Russians who are writing about this and are saying that they are appalled at the amount of propaganda that he's churning out on these television programs that he's got complete control of. And therefore, anybody who questions the actions at this point are immediately under duress or in prison. So I think that the man he himself has compared himself to Peter the Great, so I don't think that's an exaggeration. But the point is, I think that he has so many of these oligarchs in his claws, and my sense is that right now he also has a firm grasp on what the toleration level is in the Russian population. However, where are all of those body bags going when they come back? What about all those mothers? And where are those soldiers coming from that have been just slaughtered down in Ukraine? Not slaughtered, but have been killed in Ukraine. That's a problem that he doesn't want to talk about. And so my sense is that, you can speculate about whether or not there would be somebody in the middle of the Kremlin who said, hey, we had enough of this guy. But I think he's got a very deep control of what's going on. He wasn't in the KGB for nothing. And I think he's got a really good command of who he has under his belt for the moment. He's in power for another decade. He changed the law. And so unless somebody comes up with an example or says he's got to step down because he's ill, I don't think we should count on what you just said as a scenario. It's plausible, but I don't see it. Right here, I think, was a gentleman.
Two questions. Could you speak more to the current German coalition, which seems very odd, especially with the Free Democrats? What are the Christian Democrats doing since they messed up so badly? And then second question, the Baltic nations seem to be rather concerned that the United States is not putting more forward-based troops there. And what is the current situation with that? And I guess Poland is in the same boat.
Right, I think you're right. Let me take the second one. There is a great deal of pressure now on Biden and our Secretary of Defense to set up a permanent base in Poland. As a matter of fact, when Trump gave his speech there, he was plugging that, and then the Poles immediately said, yeah, we're going to call this Camp Trump. But whatever. The point is that the Poles want something up front. They want a permanent battalion, a permanent presence there. And the Baltics are saying the same thing because they're very thin on the ground. So that's going to happen, but it's going to have to happen with other European troops, not just U.S. troops. I think on the and it could be 100,000. I think on the coalition situation, let me point out something that I think is probably unfair, but I'll say it anyway. Scholz is a default chancellor. In the summer of 2021, I was speaking at some government institution, and they said, who's going to win this election and who's going to be the next chancellor? And I proudly suggested that it would be the CDU chancellor because he would win. He at that point was the head of the biggest state in the country, North Rhine-Westphalia. And this guy made all kinds of mistakes in the next few weeks, made egg all over my face on this, and he lost. But the fact is that Mr. Scholz was elected with a 26% majority. Now that's not a particularly a strong, result when you think about what he has to do as chancellor. So he's got a coalition that's never existed before. And you've got very strong different views in the FDP about how much money the government should be spending and not too much, please. And the FDP is much more a kind of an Erhard, old-style economic, let's keep things under control things. Whereas the Greens came into the coalition with a huge agenda about the environment, and now that's been kicked overboard because of the Ukraine situation, for now. Each of them, all three of these coalitions, parties, have their own constituencies to worry about. The Greens have to worry about the fact that they've got many people who are a little upset about that nuclear deal now that was just made yesterday. And the SPD has got a whole bunch of people who are saying, hey, let's not get on the war train here too much, Mr. Scholz. We have to make friends with the Russians. After all, they're going to be there after this war is over. And then you've got, these competing constituencies that are also dictating what the parameters of each of their leaders can do and they can't do. So would the CDU be in a position to make a move out of that and say, well, listen, guys, you over here with the FDP and the Greens, why don't you come over our side? Because we're a little bit more flexible and we don't have all these lefties in the SPD who are railing against the fact that you guys are taking us to war. You don't have to worry about that with us. Well, they got a problem because their leader is somebody by the name of Friedrich Merz, and nobody likes him. So as a result, it's a little bit difficult for him to circle around the wagons in the CDU because of his own constituency not being terribly coherent at the moment. It's the first time they've been in opposition for decades. So everybody's got a little bit of a problem, and Mr. Scholz has one on top of all of that, and that is that the man was finance minister before, he was labor minister before that. His activities in the field of foreign policy were very minimal. He didn't have a whole lot of shall we say, experience in that field. And I have to say this just because I heard it constantly when I was over there. He's a miserable communicator. He doesn't know how to excite people or to get people behind him as easily as, somebody like Helmut Schmidt, one of his predecessors, was able to do. He's almost like Mrs. Merkel. If you know what I mean when I say that, Mrs. Merkel was very, she dithered a lot. She simply said, well, let's just see how things develop here. Or let's just take things one step at a time. She had a wonderful picture of herself as a what's a Zahltanzer? A person a tightrope artist. And she would have this big long stick in front of her. And she said she would walk down that plank on that rope and, she'd keep things balanced. And it wasn't quite clear where she was going. Another person said, I love being with Merkel in her plane. Country's doing well, but I just like to know where she's going to land the plane at some point or another. So, but Scholz is kind of like that. in the sense that he's not somebody who is very vociferous like Gerhard Schroeder, or someone like that who would simply be a little bit more bombastic. So that makes him a little bit challenged in the sense of being able to sort of circulate some adrenaline, particularly when you've got all kinds of conflicts. You've got COVID, you've got Ukraine, you've got a recession staring you at the face. You've got any number of questions about what all your companies are going to do that are making money hand over fist in China. You're going to cut back on that? So there's all kinds of challenges coming simultaneously at Germany, and Mr. Scholz is sort of fielding a lot of balls in the field. So I think they're not going to go away. I mean, I don't think that the coalition is going to collapse or anything like that, because the three of them have so much at stake. They don't want to give up the power that they've managed to accrue by virtue of having a governing coalition. But this year is going to be a rough one. Yes, sir.
Can you wait just a second, please?
Sorry about that. Yeah, as I sit here and look at, think of that map, the situation on the ground in the Ukraine, it reminds you of the Western Front about 1915, 16, when things settled down into the trench stalemate. What do you think it'll take to upset the apple cart and and break through this? Because otherwise, the alternative, it sounds like we're just going to have this festering sore of a war, like the Donbass thing. And a couple people killed, every week or so, but it just never ended, and you just couldn't get any, stable economic activity, because of it.
I wish more people were trying to figure out the answer to your question. My sense is that we are going to be looking at something that'll go straight through next summer, in the sense of both sides trying to gather ground as best they can. But at some point or another, maybe it's going to be Turkey again, I don't know, there's going to have to be some form of discussion. They had one discussion about all that wheat, and that got done. And that was something that was a good thing. Now they've got to figure out, well, when you start negotiations, who's going to be sitting at the table, at what table, in what country? And that doesn't necessarily mean the fighting will stop. So how do you get negotiations going and a ceasefire at the same time? What's the incentive for Putin to call a ceasefire when he's got more intentions to grab more of the country that's still out there, or whether he's content with what he's got and just simply says, well, I'll just play for time. And the Ukrainians, what's the incentive for them to actually start beginning to recognize the fact that they may not get that part of Ukraine back? And if they get some voices coming in from France and from a few other countries say, hey, listen, Zelensky, we can't do this forever. You may have to say goodbye to some of your property down there. Who's going to be brave enough to tell Zelensky that now? And so I think this is going to be a long, drawn-out thing. And let me just remind you, I don't know how many of you were old enough to remember this. I'm not, because I was in grade school, but Korea, 1950. There was a big, huge negotiation, and we've never settled on a ceasefire. We never even settled on the end of the war. So my sense is that this is going to be one of those frozen, not so frozen conflicts that's going to be with us for a long time to come. That's a very bad situation, but I don't see anybody who's able to say, oh, well, here's the solution at this point. Yes, sir.
Getting back to the Baltics and Poland and the threats that they are perceiving.
Right.
It seems to me that the Russians, which now have 85% of their active units in Ukraine,
Right.
in a stalemate, having some of their best units
Right.
destroyed in the first few weeks of the war.
Right.
I'm wondering about the real concerns with the Baltics and Poland, because the Soviets are stuck, or the Russians, excuse me. I'm old enough to still consider them Soviets.
I do that all the time.
But they're stuck. They are emptying their jails to put these guys in as cannon fodder.
Yeah.
Do they really have the capability of pivoting to truly threaten the Baltics and Poland at this point?
No, I don't think so, but I don't think he has to. I think that the situation that is clear now is that, and even yesterday on the news, I caught it somewhere where some general on the Russian side said, we really screwed up here on a number of occasions with regard to where we were rolling these tanks down the streets. We didn't keep them covered on both sides of the battlefield. There is an enormous amount of mistakes that the Russians made, and they're paying for. But given the domestic chokehold that Mr. Putin has on Russian society right now, and I'm talking about evidence of that being in polls as best you can have them, that most people are saying, he's doing it for the fact that the Russians, have been threatened by NATO, and, people buy into that stuff. So I don't think he needs to do anything more at this point with regard to the Baltics other than simply hint at it and then stand there and figure out how long he can play poker on that end of the continent and drag it out. And at some point or another, I'm not sure exactly what the results will be, whether Zelensky will say, we can't get this back anymore. This is gone. But, there has to be an agreement that the Donetsk area, if it's going to be a republic, then it has to have a relationship with Kyiv. In other words, there's going to be a back and forth that's going to go very much into these kind of nitty-gritty things while they're fighting. So I don't think that there's much we can do, because if we get out in front and say to Zelensky, you can't hold on much longer, you might as well make a deal now, we basically pull the rug right out from under him. And I don't think that everybody's been saying that's what the Ukrainians have to tell us that they're willing to do before we tell them what they should do. So I don't think Putin needs to go into anywhere near the Baltics at this point, nor do they have the capacity. I think you're right about that. But they don't need to, because they've made the point already. Let me give you another example of this. When I was talking with my German think tank guys in Berlin, I was appalled at the amount of time that I was hearing them say to me, well, Jack, you don't want to push these guys in Moscow too far. After all, they got their finger on the nuclear button, don't they? And I said, what are you guys you have a Stockholm syndrome here? I mean, what's the matter with you? I mean, you got to call this guy's bluff. And I think that there is a terrific gap there between some of the strategists that are in Germany in particular and those that are in Poland and those who are in the Baltics or right up against it. And they're saying, we're not listening to the threat of a nuclear strike. We're looking at what is on the ground and what we need to make sure that it doesn't get that far. So, right with you, but I just want to make sure that you understand that point. The nuclear threat is something that Putin is using liberally now. And I, for one, do not think, I'm not convinced that he's thinking that he's going to use that as a weapon. But I'm thinking that the freeze, I've been around Germany for a long time. And in 1981, and 82, and 83, when I was living in Germany at the time, there was a huge, big backlash against Ronald Reagan's thoughts about putting rockets in Germany to balance out something called SS-20s, if any of you remember that. And the Germans went nuts. They said, what the hell's the matter with you? We are the theater of the theater nuclear war. What are you doing here? You're putting weapons into this country that could raise the specter of a nuclear war. And the response on the US side was, hey guys, the SS-20s are already there. Anyway, the result was that the weapons went in. There was a meeting of minds with the Russians, and 7 years later, the Soviet Union didn't exist. So I just think that we have to challenge Putin on that particular issue and say, we don't believe you, and now you're going to hear from us about what we're willing to do. That's my feeling, but call me a warmonger. Yes, ma'am. Or I'm sorry.
Speaking to that very subject, I find myself wondering if we're not being a little overly sensitive to what the Ukrainians do with our weapons. It seems to me like we're tying their hands with the weapons that we give them or give them to use because we're so afraid that it will involve us in this war. But it seems to me like we're just making it more likely that they can't fight this war, and the Russians are paying big time from the standpoint of their servicemen, but their land is not paying a price at all. And I just wonder if you could address that.
Well, you get that from some Germans and some Ukrainians, particularly, saying, why don't we get the Leopard? Why don't we get the Abrams tanks? Why don't we get the stuff that we can blast the hell out of these people down there? My sense is, though, that Biden has gone out of his way to say we don't want a war with Russia. We don't want to have a NATO conflict with Russia. How do you define that? I mean, we're shipping stuff across the Ukrainian border every single day, which is being made in the United States. And so are the Dutch, and so are the French, and so are the Germans. So, Putin's been sitting watching that. He hasn't attacked that chain of command. He hasn't interdicted that at all. So I think he's as afraid of the conflict with NATO as Joe Biden is saying we don't want to have that necessarily escalate. And I wish we could do more. I think we should do more. And for God's sake, I think the Germans should do more because of the capacity they have to do it. But my point is that the Ukrainians are in a position, as I see it, to hold on to what they have now, and then figure out when they're ready to negotiate what they will negotiate about. It could well be that there is going to have to be some meeting of minds here on those two republics. I don't know what it's going to be. But it's for them to decide and for us to make it possible for them to sit down and have an eyeball-to-eyeball discussion with the Russians and not be bamboozled by Putin. And certainly not be bamboozled by Putin threatening with a nuclear trigger. I don't think that's going to happen. But he's using that as blackmail.
We have a bomb, too.
Well, precisely. But yeah, he will. I mean, that's what all of us lived through this for 50 years. I mean, I remember learning when I was in school, in classrooms, about how to get under a desk in case of a nuclear bomb, Remember all of that? So it just seems to me that that's really where we have to stand up a little bit further and put a little bit more backbone in what we're trying to do. Am I missing? I missed somebody over here. Sir, go ahead.
There you go, sir. I was always hoping that what would cause Russia, when would they give in? When would Putin give in? And what turned my stomach is when I heard the Russian Orthodox Church back Putin and calling the Ukrainians Nazis and worse words than that.
Right. Well, we've had our experience with people like that in various different parts of the world. The Christian church and its behavior in the Nazi period wasn't exactly stellar either, was it? And so I think but that's unfortunate because, the Russians have a sense, if you'll permit me to generalize for a minute, when you look at Russia, can I put that map back on here for a minute? Just maybe might be worth looking at it again. This country doesn't have any natural borders. And when you think about it, the country was created by essentially conquering other peoples within it. And as a result, his attitude, Putin's attitude, which he made so clear in a July 11 speech in St. Petersburg, when he said, I'm just doing what Peter the Great did. I'm asserting our cultural, political, if for no other word, empire. And I think that's what he has in his head. And so when you have that kind of It's a wonderful German word. It's called Sendungsbewusstsein, the sense of mission that he has in his head to restore the Soviet Union, which he felt was the worst disaster in the 20th century when it imploded. Think about that. So he wants to restore all of that. And the question is, how do you separate that if you've got the blessing of a 78-year-old man who doesn't know what he's talking about and blessing bombs? But he's got a chokehold on. That's why there's a split. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but a huge split between the Ukrainian and the Russian Orthodox Church. So God help us, I remember the very first time I read my first book by Senator William Fulbright, and he said that in the First World War, the Germans had belt buckles that they were given on their soldiers' uniforms, and it said, "God with us," And how many times have we heard that explain things for anybody's war? I'm sorry, I keep missing this lady over here. Yeah.
Thank you. I think the U.S. and maybe even Europe allows Putin to intimidate us too easily.
Right.
And I remember when, what's that activist's name? Activist over in Russia prison. Navalny says Putin only understands power.
Yes, he does.
So could it have been a mistake that, Zelensky wanted us to protect the airspace over that country? Do you think it was a mistake we didn't do that? Or with Europe,
I'm not a military expert, and I can't really say whether or not that would have been prohibited by virtue of the fact that, if for no other reason, Ukraine is not a member of NATO and therefore is not under Article 5. I know that that's an excuse, but there were discussions, particularly, I go back to my friends in Poland, who were willing to give jets to the Ukrainian pilots who know how to fly these old Soviet, contraptions, as long as they were able to be restored on their side with more modern jets from Germany or from the US. And the Germans didn't have the jets, it would have to come from us. So there was some talk about that. But it got replaced with another tool, and that was drones. And it's been drones that have been very effective in wiping things out on the ground when it comes to Russian cannons and Russian tanks and even Russian planes. I mean, I think they banged up a few even in Crimea the other day, which I found very interesting. There you go, 8. So I sense that that gets back to your question about the fact that, some people felt a little uneasy about when you would wind up with an air cover that was supplied by whom. If it's supplied by a NATO partner on its own, that's one thing. If it's supplied by a NATO emblem on the plane, that's another. And so that's this dance that they've been doing around how far they can go and how far Putin is going to allow them to go. But I'll come back to what I said to your friend in the back there. He's using blackmail on the use of potentially nuclear weapons in defense of the homeland. It's written in their doctrine. They have this doctrine which says, if the homeland is in danger, we can use nuclear weapons. They have that somewhere in some drawer in Moscow. But I just don't think we can't take that as a way of him explaining to the rest of the world why he's going to get his way.
That's what, if he keeps thinking he can use it as a threat.
Exactly.
Whatever stops him.
That's exactly the point, and that gets back to the question about whether the next step would be a threat toward Poland or even the Baltics. Has anybody been to Lithuania? So you know that if you walk along the coast, you run into a certain little Soviet Kaliningrad, which is full of weapons.
What about the Suwalki Gap?
Exactly, and we don't know how to defend that. No, but that's a real ball of wax. But I think that the fact is that these little weapons have been sitting there in this little concave area. You know, this is a place where Immanuel Kant used to live, and they've got all these weapons that are standing there. Yeah, I don't have a picture of it. It's right here, right in here, right in there. And but the point is that we dealt with this kind of standoff innumerable times. All of us, or at least I do, remember the missiles of October of 1962. Do you remember getting off the school bus then and thinking you were going to not see your friends the next day because of what was going to happen in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis? We got through that by the skin of our teeth. But I think that basically, I think this is the moment in time where we need something like Kennedy did then. And we've got to figure out a way to deal with this guy because he is on a mission, and a mission from God. And that's even worse. Yes, sir.
I want to get to his mission. I'm sorry, sir.
Oh, sorry.
There's been a different perspective of why Putin invaded Ukraine at that time. Is it possible, too, that with Angela Merkel no longer being in the picture, that might have contributed to why he went into Ukraine? And what was their relationship? Was it a pretty good relationship between Merkel and Putin?
Well, it's a story that really is very interesting because I've had a chance to talk to her about it. I would say, to answer to your first question, is that I don't think he made the decision because she left. I think he made the decision because of the fact that he felt that he wasn't sure Schultz would respond. Schultz had been in office since December. You have a weak, uncertain government, a government that hasn't been tested yet. He might have seen an opportunity there. He went out he sat down and talked with Xi in Beijing and said, I'm going to do this. You're going to back me? And he said yes. And I think that basically the issue was that he felt that he had an opportunity here to strike while the iron was hot and do it in a fashion where he would catch the Germans off guard. Merkel had been on guard since she was in the Kanzleramt in 2005. She knew this guy. She could speak his language. I don't think that he felt that that was the same kind of threat, if you want to call it a threat, or at least a recognition of him and what his real intentions were. Yeah, he did. Here's the anecdote that you might find amusing. They were together when they came into office. He came in office in 2000, right? She came in 2005. So they were basically, feeling each other out in those first few years. And when it came to 2014, she was the one that led the effort to put him together with people in Minsk in the Belarus negotiations. She led that. She created that with France. And basically, it was his thought that she had an angle on him that could figure out how to keep him from moving forward. She had been the one, again, to point out something that's historically important. She was the one in 2008 who, much against George W. Bush, said, do not give Georgia a recognition as a potential candidate for NATO. Don't do that now. She held fast on that and stopped it cold. Bush wanted to do it right away in Bucharest. So I think that he felt that she knew a lot more about him than anybody else on the continent. And she spent 16 years studying him. Here's the anecdote. She goes to see him in Sochi. And he's got this palace out there, right? And he says, come down and see me in my palace. So Merkel's not particularly enthusiastic about that, but she's the one that keeps talking to him in Russian. She's in the room with him. It's a big room, 2 big chairs, and in walks his wolfhound. Merkel has been afraid of dogs since she was 10. The dog walks in, walks around, smells things, you know, sort of brushes up against her and so forth. And he did that on purpose. And she held very strong on that and basically said, I think it was because he thought he was missing something else. So they knew each other. And I think that, but I think he saw an opportunity here, you know, to strike at a point where maybe he wasn't sure, you know, what Biden was going to say. Maybe he hadn't read him correctly. But he was, you know, the CIA and the DIA and a number of other intelligence agencies told Zelensky and told the Europeans that he was going to attack. And most people didn't want to see it that way, and the Germans particularly. So I think he was taking advantage of that. Did I miss somebody? Oh, yeah.
Thank you. I have a comment and then a question. So I worked for the Defense Department, and for about 10 years between 2000 and 2010, I was working with the Russians on Arctic waste cleanup connected with the nuclear submarine dismantlement program.
Wow.
And I got to say that the Russian military at that time wanted to be integrated with Europe. And I think it would be interesting to know what they're really thinking about this, because I think what Mr. Putin is doing is not necessarily, not only what the average Russian doesn't want, but I'm not even convinced a lot of people in the military really want this, because they were always questioning me as to why we weren't more supportive of Russia versus China, and why we were so intent on building up trade with China and building up their economy versus working with them. And it was just, somehow we've lost that opportunity to get the Russians on board with us. So I understand the German perspective, that they thought that by buying Russian gas and integrating the Russians with the economy in Europe, they would turn the Russians around. But the problem is you've got this small group of people running the country who want the empire. And so now I'll give you the second part of this, which is, so the question is, why does Mr. Putin want his empire back? And so my perspective on this is Russia is kind of wedged between NATO and the EU, which is a major economic force, and China on the other side. And they're trying to figure out how they survive stuck in the middle between those two pieces. And so you look at Ukraine, and what does Ukraine bring them? Ukraine brings them minerals, rare gases, agriculture, which combined with the Russian agricultural production buys them a whole lot. And I think Russia's basically decided the way to win this is to gather resources and the ability to transport them.
That's a hell of a, you know, that's why he's been down elsewhere. In other words, that's when he's not only been running around in Libya, but he's been talking to the Africans. And you know, he's got this military private army that he sends around to, you know, check things out and buy time for them. I think you're absolutely right. One thing I think that one might not recall, but in 2008, or was it 2007? In any case, I attended every year something called the Munich Security Conference, which was a big deal. It's like you know, it's a huge big group of people who think about strategic issues. And it was the one time that he went. And he got up there on the stage, and it was the one time he ever gave a speech, and he railed at the U.S. For having essentially bullied the rest of the world for the last 5 decades. And it was time for that to come to a close. That was 2007, 2008. You remember Georgia, and then we had 2014. This is a guy who's been on this plan for a long time. And I think that to some extent, you know, that's not something that we took seriously enough. Nobody took Crimea seriously enough when it happened. And I think that basically the question is we didn't realize how far gone Mr. Putin had gotten toward being Peter the Great reborn. And he is well there now. And my only sense there is that the German response to that was, we've been living next to this country for 800 years. We've been working with them in various different fashions. Frau Merkel had a portrait of Catherine the Great in her private office. She was, she respected women who had exercised power. But I think that to some extent we missed something there. Remember, we had the Founding Act with the Russians. Remember that? So, we probably missed something along the way. I remember in 2001, this was after, I'm right about this, maybe I'm not, but it was around 9/11. And Putin came and gave a speech in the parliament in Berlin. And the parliament building had just been completed. So it was a big deal to have a Russian president speak in the parliament in Berlin. Now at that point, many, many Germans, we're now talking 2000, I think we're talking 2001, so it's been a decade since Germany has been reunified. Don't underestimate how many Germans felt enormously grateful to a guy named Gorbachev for having made that possible. Yeah, George Herbert Walker Bush was involved too, right? But Gorby, he was the one that let it go. East Germany let it go. Didn't turn out the troops like in Tiananmen Square. So the Germans thought Gorby was next to God. And I think that if you listen to this speech that Putin gave in the front of the German parliament to all of these parliamentarians and said, Russia is a country of Europe. And he got a standing ovation. And now people begin to think, well, Jesus, now we've really put the Cold War behind us, and the Russians become part of what we're doing, and Francis Fukuyama was right, and we're all going to have a world that's going to be just terrifically peaceful. And that didn't happen. So I think that to some extent, to get back to my original points that I was trying to make earlier, Germans are going to have to go back over their own history on this and think through what it was that kept them going with regard to the hope that Russia was going to not be an enemy anymore, but it was going to be a partner. And now they're seeing that it ain't going to happen. As we here in the U.S., at the same time are just waking up to the fact that we got a problem in China that is somewhat similar with a guy who's also on a mission, maybe not from God because he doesn't believe in one, but nevertheless, he's got something in mind when the 100th anniversary in 2049 happens the way China should be. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff happening out there, guys, but I appreciate your time. I know I'm over, so I better
No
stop
problem.
there.
Thank you so very much. Really appreciate it.